Hello there, it's Deborah Irene with Storytime. I haven't read to you for a while, and I wanted to continue our series reading from my mother's book, Helen's Heritage. We've been reading in the back of her book about the clan, which are the 16 children where she was the youngest. Today, I'm happy to have my sister Vickie with me. I came over here for dinner and she fed me a wonderful meal, and I thought it would just be good to have her on story time. So we are up to the 9th sibling, so we're halfway through, and her brother Lawrence Allen. That's who we're going to be reading about today. Now, I want to remind you that these stories are written in my mother's voice, so when I say I, it's talking about my mother, Helen Herbert Gillum, as I retold her stories. This is about her brother, Lawrence Allen. And here are a couple of pictures of Lawrence. One of his wife, Mildred, and their first two children. And then the other picture is of Lawrence and Mildred later in life as they were walking out of my mom and dad's house after an evening of playing cards. Such fun. So Lawrence Allen's birth, August 23, 1919, came a full 3 years after J.D. was born, the largest age difference of all of the 16 siblings. If I look at my siblings in two groups, his birth marks the beginning of my group. He was the 9th child and 4th son. I was too young to remember when he lived in the house with me when I was growing up. I just remember that he was away, lived in the big city, and had traveled around. I thought he knew everything there was to know. He was also a veteran of the Korean War. He married Mildred Lee Clark on October 14, 1940. I thought she was the prettiest thing, and we shared a close bond the rest of our lives. They had 8 children, 4 boys and 4 girls. Their 4 younger children were the ages of my girls. When I was a teenager in Missouri, I was bored living out in the country, so I went into town and stayed with them 3 to 4 days a week at a time, as long as Dad would allow. You might recall from earlier in this book, I was at their house when Dad told me I could move to California and live with Mama. I didn't have much contact with Lawrence for several years after I went to California until he was in the service and stationed out there. He came to visit me and Mama, and I got reacquainted with him then. In later years, we lived closer together in Missouri, and he and I formed a tight bond. I could share anything with him, whether it be about kids, school, or church. He was an encourager to everyone, but especially to his immediate and extended family. He had his thoughts and I had mine, but we accepted each other. He helped me during a difficult time when Dad moved from my home around 1971. He worked out all of the details and made that process smoother than I imagined it could be. He counseled my daughters on many occasions with wisdom, truth, and humor. He was a wonderful friend and brother, and he was a good man. It was really hard on me when he died. I was in Kansas City staying with Vicky's boys while she was on a trip. Lawrence was sick when I left Bolivar for Kansas City. He thought he had the flu and had been sick for a while with emphysema. It was Christmas time, and he didn't want to go to the doctor until after their family Christmas party with their children and grandchildren. At the party, his son Keith had to take him to the emergency room. He never got to go home. The doctors discovered he had lung cancer, and I was admonished to come home soon if I wanted to see him. I had to see him and was able to talk to him just an hour before he died. I told him what a good brother he was and that I didn't know how I was going to manage without him. He told me the Lord would send someone to take his place and that I'd be okay. He ended with, "Just trust the Lord." He had petitioned the Lord several years earlier to give him more time when faced with a critical illness. That request was honored, and he did not feel that he should ask again. He felt his time had come. I had not been home long when his daughter Patsy called. "I wish you hadn't gone home," she said. Eunice and I returned to the hospital. We all stood around the bed. I had my hand on his leg. He quivered, shook, and then departed this world. On January 2, 1982, another sibling was gone too soon. He was only 62. Soon thereafter, Eunice and Rube retired from Kansas City and moved to the area. I thought about what Lawrence had said, that the Lord would send someone else. He certainly did. I would be remiss if I did not mention more about his wife, Mildred Lee. She was always there for me too. She seemed to be the first one to come in an emergency, in sickness and in death. She wrote most of our family obituaries. We grew even closer after Lawrence died. Her brother lived in Kansas City along with two of my daughters. We made several trips to Kansas City together. She was there frequently during Charles's illness and hospital stays, and she was with me when he died. She battled her own cancer and was in remission for years, but it finally overtook her, along with heart problems. When the end was near, I stopped in to see her before heading to Springfield for an appointment. Keith, and that was her son, said she had been unresponsive, but I still went into her room and said, "Mildred, I have to go to Springfield, but we'll be back after a little while." She looked up with a strange look on her face and said, "Well, what are you doing here?" I repeated that I was going to Springfield, but would be back to check on her. She didn't respond again. When I returned, Keith was outside of her room and said, "She's not here, Helen. They've already taken her." That all too familiar, empty feeling flooded me. Keith could not believe she had responded to me earlier and emphasized that she hadn't said anything all morning. I don't really know what she meant by her comment, "What are you doing here?" That must have been the last thing she said. As I pondered it over the years, I believe she was between Earth and the afterlife. I think she was walking that walk and was shocked to see me there. I just wonder. And their children were Larry Ken, who is still alive, Lyndall Keith, and we all knew him as Keith, who was born in 1943 and passed away in 2014, Patsy Kay, who was born in 1945 and passed away in 2012, Lee Allen, born in 1947, passed away in 2014, Ginger Lynn, born in 1953, passed away in 2016, and Ronald Dean, who was born in 1958, who passed away a couple of years ago. Donna Lou, the twins, and Dana Sue, both born in 1960. And I have to tell you from a personal standpoint that about a month ago, I picked up Mama's book because I knew that it was time to read another story. And I turned to the next sibling. And when I realized it was Lawrence and I reread the chapter, I started crying because we're getting to an age, a period now with the siblings where many of them were very important to me, and their children were the age that I was, and I was kind of a little bit overcome remembering them. And so I thought it's going to take me a few weeks to be able to read this chapter. So I'm here tonight reading it from my sister's house, and I want to point out something, then I'm going to ask her if she has anything she would like to say. A couple of things here. First of all, if you read my mother's book, Helen's Heritage, you're going to find Lawrence and Mildred sprinkled throughout her book because they were that important to her and important to her at various stages of her life. So this is just one brief summary of Lawrence. He's sprinkled throughout her book. Where my mother states here that when he was sick, I think she wanted him to ask the Lord to heal him. But he told her that he had already petitioned the Lord one time to heal him, and that if God granted that request and healed him, that he didn't feel like he could ever ask him again. And I just want to say that I was present when that happened. He was in a hospital, and my sister Vickie and I were trying to remember what it was he had. We think it might have been tuberculosis, but
We think so, but
that's what we
yeah.
think it was. And he was getting better and was about to be discharged. And I went with my mother to go visit him at this special hospital in southern Missouri. And we went into a waiting room area, kind of a lobby area, and he came out from his room to visit with us. And I remember that moment when he had a change in heart and a total about face and a mission, so to speak, of what God wanted him to do his last years on earth. And he was determined that he was to be a good father, uncle, grandfather, patriarch to the family, be an example, be an advisor, and take care of the family. And I have to tell you, from that moment, I was just a young girl of about 11 or 12 years old, and I saw a complete about face, and he became everything to everyone that he promised to God he would do. He did it. And I kind of wish he had asked God to heal him again, but he felt like that he made a promise to God, and God gave him those extra years then, and that he just had fulfilled what God had called him to do. I have many memories of stopping by their house as a young adult after I moved to Kansas City, and just visiting and talking, and the advice and that they would give. I know he gave advice to my sister Kathy so many times, and she was close with his daughter. I was the same age or close in age to his son Ronnie, and Vickie was the age of Ginger. So we grew up around them, and I was just visiting with Vickie before this. I know that my mother and father would have never owned a home if it hadn't been for Lawrence, because one of the things that he did when he got out of that hospital was he learned about, even though he didn't have a lot of money, he learned about the FHA loans, and he got a good paying job, a steady job. We laughed too about, as my Aunt Delta would say, a study job. And he did the paperwork and applied and got a really nice home for his family and the children who were still being raised at the time. And then, not only after he had that in place, I remember when he came over to my mom and dad's house and said, "You guys need to do this. You need to apply for this FHA loan." They had had some financial difficulties, and my dad had lost a business, and he was just devastated and didn't think they would ever own a home. And Uncle Lawrence helped them with the paperwork, and they bought their home and got it paid for before my dad even passed away. So I credit my Uncle Lawrence for that. That is just one little story that I remember. Vicki, do you have something you would like
The
to say?
only thing I can remember, I don't remember things like Debbie does, but I remember Uncle Lawrence as being funny. He and Aunt Mildred both. They always came over to the house, or we always went over there. We always had family reunions and everything, and he was so funny, and his laugh was contagious, and so was Mildred's. I remember going over to their house when Ginger and I were in school, high school, and I'd go over there, and we always went to the kitchen table. That was the gathering place, at the kitchen table, and there was always coffee and cigarettes. Coffee and cigarettes. But you know, he was the life of the party. He was funny, and he did have a lot of wisdom, and he did guide us along the way. So yeah, that's what I remember about my Uncle Lawrence.
Yes. He had a lot of wisdom, and he so cared for the family. One thing that also today reminded me that I needed to tell this story, one of his granddaughters posted a picture of her mother and one of her brothers on Facebook, and talking about how much she missed her mother. And it kind of took me back in years, and I was trying to place her brother that was with her mother in the picture, and I had to ask, which brother is this? Because they had several children in their family, and I used to babysit for them when I was about 11 or 12 years old, so she had to remind me who that brother was. And I have to tell you, in my book, Someday I Will Write, I have a chapter in there called The Babysitters Reflection. Yeah, and that's babysitter twice. And it's about his daughter, Patsy, because she was my babysitter and Vicky's babysitter when we lived in California. She was a teenager, and boy, could she really dance back in the 60s.
Yeah,
and so I talk about that. And she kind of passed away a little bit unexpectedly several years ago. I know she went in for heart surgery, and we weren't expecting her not to make it. But so that's why I wrote that blog, was about her when she passed away unexpectedly. But she was our babysitter. This was Lawrence and Mildred's daughters, one of their daughters. And then when she had a baby of her own, I became that baby's babysitter, and then I also babysat for I think almost all of their grandchildren, now that I think about it, of the older kids, because I babysat for Sherry and Larry Kinn's kids, and I babysat for Lee Allen and Mona's kids, and I babysat for Patsy. But I was reminded of that. So there's a story in here about their daughter Patsy, and it's called The Babysitters Reflection. So what are we saying here today? And I think my sister Vickie would agree with me on this, is not only was my mother so appreciative of her large family, and that's one reason she wrote the book. She wanted everybody to know what a blessing it was to have a large family and how close they were, and we experienced that as well. And we may not see our family every day, but we still feel that closeness, and we still feel that spiritual heritage. You know, another thing that my Uncle Lawrence certainly wasn't perfect, and like everybody else, he made mistakes over the years, but he encouraged my mother on his deathbed. She said, you know, I just don't think I'm going to make it without you. Why? Because he was such a good advisor to her, and he told her that the Lord would send someone to take his place. Just trust the Lord. That was the last thing he told her. So we're grateful today for our spiritual heritage. And if you want to learn more about it, I would invite you to get a copy of my mother's book, Helen's Heritage, Life Stories of Helen Herbert Gillum as Told to Deborah Irene. You can find that on Amazon. You can find it at Barnes & Noble, Westbow Press. You can go to my website, deborahirene.com, DeBrairene, and find links to all of 3 of my books there. Thank you, Vicki, for
Thank you.
today. And
I enjoyed listening.
We'll be back in a few weeks with the next sibling story.